Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As many of you may know, the land of Israel is currently in a very precarious situation. We have full faith in God that He will take care of us, take care of the Jewish people. But there's no better thing we could be doing now than studying Torah, doing mitzvahs, adding in Torah study, adding in mitzvah observance, charity, and prayer. So let's begin. In this week's Torah portion, Parsha Ba'aloischa talks about the Passover offering that the Jewish people did while in the desert. They only did one offering while they were in the desert. Why is a discussion for another time? And one of the there are certain laws that are learned from this specific teaching and this specific commandment to do the Passover offering in the desert, and we're going to talk about the history of these specific laws. So let's get into it. This is Numbers chapter 9. God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai during the second year following their exodus from the land of Egypt in the first month, saying, "Children of Israel shall offer the Passover offering lamb at its appointed time. On the 14th day of the month, in the afternoon, you shall offer it at its appointed time, in accordance with all its statutes and in accordance with all its ordinances, you shall offer it." Moses spoke to the children of Israel to offer the Passover lamb. Okay, so the question is, why does the Torah say and emphasize that this Passover offering has to be given on its time? The Torah already told us it should be given on the 14th day. So let's go into a little history to understand what this idea of the appointed time. So if you go to the Talmud, Psachim, page 66a, the Talmud records as follows. Our rabbis taught the halacha of whether a Passover offering should be brought on Shabbos was forgotten by the Bnei Beseira. The Bnei Beseira, the children of Beseira, were the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the court, and they forgot the halacha whether or not the Passover offering should be brought on Shabbos. Kind of like we had this year, right? We had Shabbos was the 14th day and going straight into Passover. So first day Passover was Saturday night or Sunday, and therefore the Erev Pesach was Shabbos, and that is the time when you actually go to the temple and bring the Passover offering. So one time when Passover fell on Sunday, so Erev Shabbos, Shabbos was Erev Pesach, they forgot the halacha whether it's brought or not. And they made an announcement. Does anybody know what the law is if the Passover lamb overrides the Shabbos? So of course, Shabbos is you're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbos. That is forbidden, except the exceptions of sacrifices in the temple. However, only communal sacrifices, for example, every single day, 365 days a year, is the Karban Tamid, is the twice a day, the constant offering in front of God. So that was once in the morning, once in the afternoon. On Shabbos, so that was also on Shabbos. On Shabbos, there also was the offerings of the Musaf, the extra offering special for Shabbos. So the question is this Passover offering seemingly it's a private offering. Every individual has to bring it at the same time. Everybody's doing it at the same time, specific time on the 14th day. So which one is it? So they said, listen, there's one guy. His name is Hillel. He is from Babylon, and he knows whether or not he was a close student of Shmaya Vatalion. They were the leaders of the court in the previous generation, and he knows. So they send for Hillel, and they say to Hillel, what is the he gives two reasons. One reason he gave is he gave a logical explanation, and then he actually quotes our verse that we're discussing today, and it says that at its appointed time. In the Hebrew, it's b'may adai, and it's at its appointed time, and it says b'may adai by the Karban Tamid, by this constant offering that is brought every day that we mentioned before. So he says, just like over there, it's every single day, even on Shabbos. So to here, it overrides Shabbos as well. And they immediately put him as the head of the court, and Hillel became the Nasi. he became the head of the Sanhedrin, and he started to teach them all the halachas of Passover. Okay, all the laws of Passover. So it's a very interesting story. So again, everybody forgot the law, whether Pesach is brought on Shabbos or not, and Hillel remembered the law, and therefore he was appointed as the head of the court. So the question is, how could it be that they would forget the law? Seemingly, this is something that's happens pretty often. It's not super often. It happens. We'll see in a second exactly how often it happens. So this is something that happens, every so often. Why not just ask everybody, what did you do last time this happened? Take a poll. Send out an email. I don't know. Ask all the people who are sitting in the Sanhedrin. So the Talmud, Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, asked this exact question. Rabbi Oven said, "It is not possible. Isn't it impossible that sorry, let's say again. It is impossible that in 2 Shemitah cycles, meaning in 14 years, you will not have a Shabbos being on Erev Pesach. So therefore, how could it be that the law was forgotten?" So he explains the Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, and this is in chapter 6 of the Masechtas Pesachim. He says, in order to bring greatness to Hillel, because Hillel was deserving of being the leader of the court, and so therefore, this by divine providence, this story happened. They forgot in order that they should appoint Hillel as the leader. Okay, interesting idea. However, if that is the case, if we look at the Talmud, though, that's not what the Talmud says. Seemingly, again, this is something that is something that happened all the time, as we just explained. So surely somebody knew. The idea that they had to ask Hillel is a really, really shocking idea that nobody would know. In fact, the Passover offering was one of the most important parts of Jewish life in the Temple era. And it would have been a tremendous miracle that everybody forgot and nobody remembered what happened last time. Further, we could even look at non-Jewish sources that discuss the Passover offering. So we know that this was a tremendous thing. This wasn't like some random thing that happened that nobody really knew about. This is something that was a prominent, important part of Jewish life in the temple. So, for example, you go to Seder Hadaras. It's a historical treatise on the Jewish people, and they record a Roman account of the Passover offering. So he writes as follows. They hurried to the stream near Jerusalem. On the 14th of the month, they appointed people to ascend the high tower of the temple, and they blew trumpets and announced, the time of the Pesach offering has come. The people immediately dressed in their holiday finery. When they arrived at the place of the slaughter, there were rows of priests, each holding a golden spoon, and another line of priests holding silver spoons. All this was done for aesthetics. The priest at the head of the line received the spoon of the blood from the sacrifice and passed it one to the other, and so on until it reached the altar. The priest at the altar would scatter the blood and return the empty spoon up the line, and in such a manner that each priest received a full spoon and returned an empty one. This carried out so quickly that the spoons appeared to be flying. The sounds of the Hillel songs were heard from very far away. The gates of Jerusalem stayed open on the night of Pesach because the numbers of passersby were so great, at times double that of the Jews who left Egypt. So we're talking about millions of people walking around in Jerusalem doing this. How could you forget what happened? Again, within 14 years, nobody remembered. So we have the Tzalach, is a commentary on the Talmud, and he explains as follows. He says that seemingly there must have been a law that Passover was not meant to fall out on Sunday, therefore avoiding the this dilemma of having the Passover offering fall on Shabbos. And when the Talmud says that the law was forgotten, it doesn't mean that they forgot the law of whether or not the Passover offering is brought on Shabbos. It means they forgot to arrange the calendar in such a way that ensuring that Passover would not fall out in this way. Therefore, since they forgot, they didn't know what to do. Okay, now, for example, we'll give 2 examples of interesting calendar things that we do in order to have holidays fall out or not fall out on certain days. For example, Hoshana Rabbah is the 7th day of Sukkot. It's a very special day. It's also obviously the day before Shmini Atzeres, the last day of the next holiday immediately following Sukkot. But in and of itself, it's a very special day. And one of the things they would do was they would do what's called the mitzvah of the arava. They would encircle the mizbeach, the altar, with giant aravas, giant willows. We do nowadays. We don't have the temple. We use willows and we hit them on the floor. It's a different custom to remind us of that custom. And even though this practice is only a custom and therefore would not override Shabbos, because there would be carrying or whatever it would be, maybe they had to cut them. I'm not exactly sure what the prohibition was, but it was not to be. Since it was not, they didn't want to miss out on this practice, even though it was just a custom. They would make sure that Rosh Hashanah would only fall out on certain days. In addition, Yom Kippur cannot fall out on Friday, because then they also didn't want Yom Kippur to fall out on Friday or Sunday. They didn't want that the fasting should be immediately followed or preceded by feasting. So essentially, or have basically 2 days of full Shabbos restrictions. So therefore, the rabbis made a thing called loy adu rosh, that which literally means, it doesn't mean anything. It's an acronym. It means that Rosh Hashanah cannot fall out on Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, thereby avoiding these issues of Hoshana Rabbah falling on Shabbos or Yom Kippur falling out on Sunday or falling out on Friday. So we see that there's such a precedent that we arrange the calendar in such a way that should be avoided. What they essentially would do is they would not, if Rosh Hashanah could fall out on one of these days, based on when the new moon was appearing, they would essentially not, the courts which would hear testimony of the birth of the new moon would just not hear testimony on that day in order to make sure that Rosh Hashanah would fall out on the proper day, etc. Now, so it makes sense that they forgot to do such a thing. They forgot to do this shenanigans, if you want to call it that, these workarounds, in order that shouldn't fall out in that way. However, what is fast, and it makes sense, some people would forget that it wasn't done. And again, this is by a small amount of people, right? Just the court, and the court forgot to do it. But the only problem is with this explanation is that this is not mentioned anywhere. The Tzalach is a commentary that comes much later than the Talmudic times. So, number one, we don't find this explanation anywhere. This should have been somewhere in the Talmud say, listen, you got to arrange the calendar in such a way that Erev Pesach does not fall on Shabbos. Not mentioned anywhere, number one. And number two is, we actually find that the second Pesach that was after the Exodus was on Shabbos. So the way we know that is, and this is the Passover we're talking about, right? That the Talmud says that the Rosh Chodesh Nisan fell out on Sunday. That was the day they erected the tabernacle. So if Rosh Chodesh falls out on Sunday, and the 14th day of Nisan will be on Shabbos. So that second Erev Pesach in history was on Shabbos, and we don't find any mention that they tried to avoid that. So it doesn't really. Another time we see that, but as an aside, is that we see that when the walls of Jericho occurred, the walls of Jericho fell down, and that entire saga that occurred on Shabbos, the 28th day of Nisan. So based on that, again, if Shabbos is the 28th day of Nisan, it means Sunday would be 28th day of Nisan, which would mean 2 weeks earlier would also be Shabbos, and therefore Passover would have fallen out on Passover would have fallen on Sunday, meaning Erev Pesach was Shabbos. So we see another time in history, clear in the scripture, that that Pesach fell out on Shabbos, and Joshua didn't make a big deal about it. So, and again, going back to what we were saying, we see from the Jerusalem Talmud clearly that Passover has to fall out twice. Within 2 Shemitah cycles, within 14 years, for sure, Passover has to fall out, and such a cycle has to fall out on Sunday, meaning Erev Pesach would be Shabbos. So, how is it possible that they didn't remember? And the truth is, we could actually find even more serious questions on classical Jewish observance that there was debate about. For example, in the Talmud in Menachos, chapter page 41b, there's a debate how many strings are on tzitzis. So we'll read it over here. The rabbis taught how many strings are needed. Beis Shammai says you need 4, and Beis Hillel says you need 3. So if that's the case, again, the Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are towards the they're towards the end of the Second Temple era. Seemingly, this would be something that people should have known. Just go look down on your tzitzis. I could look here right now. I could tell you mine have 4 strings. They're doubled over, which makes 8. So I could tell you. Why didn't Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel just go look? Let's go outside and look at everyone's tzitzis that's walking by. Jews have been keeping tzitzis at that point for over 1,000 years. For sure, somebody knew the answer. They do it every day. Doesn't that make sense? And we've been talking about till now something that happens once in 14 years. It's a shock that they won't remember. We're talking about tzitzis. Everybody keeps it every day. Now, if we go further, there's a question about tefillin. Tefillin, there are. I don't want to get into the entire topic right now. It's a very long topic, but essentially, there's a debate. What is the order of the parshios in the tefillin? If you look at the head tefillin, it's actually 4 compartments that sits on top of the head, and I'll put into one. And basically, there's a debate about whether the 4 times that the Torah talks about tefillin, they go in each compartment. The debate is, what's the order? Is it the order that the way they are written, or in chronological order of the Torah, or are they in the order of that the Shema prayer should be next to the other Shema prayer? There's 2 prayers that mention the words. I'm sorry, not the 2 Shemas. I'm sorry, the 2 Vahayas. There's 2 prayers that both mention Vahaya, and the question is, should the Vahaya prayer, the Vahaya sections be next to each other, or should they be in chronological order? Rashi famously says they should be in the order of the chronology, and Rabbeinu Tam, who happened to be Rashi's grandson, quotes that they should use the order based on having the 2 Vahayas next to each other. Now, again, same question. Why didn't Rashi just go to his father's tefillin, go to anyone's tefillin? You could do excavations and find an old pair of tefillin and see how they set it up. Or you can look further, and you can, and the same thing goes for the tzitzis, right? They could have just asked. So, and this is something that's post-Talmudic, the tefillin debate. At least the tzitzis debate is in the Second Temple era. But here we're talking about a post-Talmudic debate, many hundreds of years after the Talmud, and no one had this debate before. This is very, very shocking. And again, if you follow one opinion, you're versus the other, according to the opposite opinion, you're not even wearing tefillin once in your life. If you only put on Rashi tefillin, then according to Rabbeinu Tam, you never put on tefillin before. And according to Rashi, if you put on Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin, you never put on tefillin before. Hold on one second. Sorry for the delay. Okay. So, as we were saying, the question is, why didn't they just examine these articles that everybody was using every single day, all the time? You could look at tefillin, you could look at a pair of tzitzis, you could ask people what they did last time that Pesach fell on Shabbos. So, if we look at history, the Talmud actually relates in multiple places that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, this is the source of this debate, for example, about tzitzis, and they debate about many, many things. They debate how you light the menorah, right? There's many, many debates between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. That because of these major differences, in their observance, they actually refused to marry each other. However, that only was for a short period of time. At some point, the rabbis decided that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. In 99% of cases, happens to be tzitzis, we follow Beis Shammai, but okay. And once the halacha was decided, this idea that people wouldn't intermarry into groups that follow halacha differently ended. Why? Because the halacha was decided, and now everybody has to follow the same halacha. And we find this in other places as well. For example, we know when it comes to the laws of keeping kosher, the Torah tells us that you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So the Talmud learns out many special laws about keeping kosher from this. Why did the Torah use these specific words? And one of the basic ideas is that why is a kid in its mother's milk? Because it has to be something, an animal, which produces milk. That is the type of animal that cannot be cooked in milk versus, let's say, an animal like chicken or a bird would not be permitted. However, the rabbis taught that we should not eat even chicken in milk because it looks too similar, and that is something that has been going on for thousands of years. Now, when it comes to practical, how did the Jewish people practice? Did they actually eat chicken in milk? The Rabbi Yossi Aglili, he was from Galilee, and when people would go there, they were shocked that there were Jews who were serving chicken or birds cooked in milk. And he comes back to his teachers and he says, we should excommunicate this town. You know what they're doing? They're cooking birds in milk. We know that you're not allowed to do that. The rabbis forbade that. And they said, no, they live in the area where Rabbi Yossi was their rabbi, and therefore they followed him. And again, there was times, and there's many, many stories about this. We know that even till today, Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities practice things differently because the law was never decided. The law in those communities was decided one way. The laws in other communities were decided slightly differently, and therefore there has never been any kind of Sanhedrin until now now that Jewish Ashkenazim and Sephardic Jews are living together, there hasn't ever been really a consensus. So people have their own communities and they follow their own way. However, that can only exist until the law was decided. And therefore, so again, going back to the story of the chicken and milk, that the law obviously at that point had not been decided. There was still a debate about it, but at one point it was decided. The law was clear, and for thousands of years, Jews have been very careful about not eating chicken and milk. Now, the same thing could be said about all these other scenarios that we've been discussing. That there was a debate at some point, but the law at some point was settled, and by the Sanhedrin, or by the Talmud, or by whatever the methods that we use nowadays to determine Jewish law, which majority or tradition, etc. And this story that we discussed in the Talmud about the keeping whether or not the Passover offering was brought on Shabbos, that was something that was also subject to debate at that time, or at a previous time. And at that previous time, there were some Jews who brought the Passover offering on Shabbos, and there were some Jews who were the opinion that you do not bring the Passover offering on Shabbos. And what the Bnei Beseira, what the children of Beseira forgot, who were the leaders of the Sanhedrin at that time, they forgot what was the conclusion of the Sanhedrin of the previous generation. Had they come to a conclusion, and if so, what was their conclusion? And therefore, at that point, they were looking for somebody who remembered what was the vote of the Sanhedrin. And therefore, what is the united front, the united Jewish law? What is the ruling? And for that, they needed somebody who had a close relationship to the rabbis of the previous generation, Shammai and Avtalion, and that was Hillel. And therefore, they called Hillel. And again, there has been the same thing when it comes to tzitzis and it comes to tefillin and all these other things, that there has now been a consensus that the halacha follows the opinion of Rashi. Now, many people put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin as well. That's a special stringency. We'll talk about it another time. And we actually found, if you go back in history, they've actually done excavations where they found some tefillin that have been, from the temple era, that have some tefillin have the way according to Rashi, and some tefillin have the way according to Rabbeinu Tam. So obviously the law was never followed, and therefore the debate continued until at some point the rabbis came to a consensus that halacha follows Rashi. And there are even opinions that even in time of Moses, there were multiple approaches. So what we see from here is that many times people think that how could it be that there's debate about things that are seemingly historical facts? Well, it seems that history is not as black and white as we all might have thought. And in truth, there are many ways, there are many opinions and many debates that have gone on for many, many years. But at some point, whenever the law is decided, we all know we have to follow our community rabbis and follow the way they've decided the law. And that is the way we keep the Torah and keep the mitzvahs until the coming of Mashiach, maybe speedily in our days, and we will see true peace in the land of Israel. Have a good Shabbos. I don't believe there's going to be a class next week, but we will see you next time.